Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Implementation Readiness, in which we talk about preconditions for a successful CPQ implementation journey. Today's speaker is Johannes Muschal, our Senior Vice President Success Delivery. He is very familiar with the challenges and pitfalls of CPQ implementations, and most important, he knows how to avoid them. Now it's time to hand over to Johannes. Enjoy the session. Johannes, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Ralph, and welcome everyone from my side as well. When talking now through the content of the webinar, I will not go too much into detail. I will try to follow more general do's and don'ts. But of course, if you have any kind of more detailed questions, please put them up, as Ralph mentioned, in the chat, and I'm happy to answer them then in the Q&A session part. So we will start now talking a bit about prerequisites to be met for a successful implementation journey. And I do, from time to time, talk about do's and don'ts when we talk about these prerequisites. And that will take roughly 25 to 30 minutes. So we have some good time for the Q&A later on. So first of all, I guess you're here because you have sort of or mostly taken a decision to start with a CPQ implementation because you want to go for a CPQ solution. So congratulations for that. I think it's always a good decision, and CPQ can deliver a lot of value to you. But when we talk implementation, there's actually no truth how to continue from here. And that is something I want to just put with you to start with. So it's really about looking into your company, looking into your case and seeing what is the best fit to make CPQ a good solution for you and how we can unlock all the value of a CPQ to make that work for you as a customer. And that is not just true when working with Tacton. Everything I talk you through in this session here will be true when talking with any CPQ vendor and working with any CPQ vendor out there in the world. So again, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to each and every one. You always need to adapt and adjust a little bit to your organization. And that is something I really recommend you to talk to every CPQ vendor, making sure that you're not just putting their framework on your organization, but really look into, can that work with us? And so the question is now where to start now, and how do I really identify what is the right approach to tackle a CPQ implementation for my company. And when we start implementation journeys, we always ask the customer to say, okay, what is your vision with the CPQ? What do you really want to achieve? Why do you go for a CPQ, and what is kind of the ultimate target for you and your organization looking into the future? And that means this is not about, talking like, okay, I want to reduce the number of headcounts, or I want to get rid of an old system and replace that. It's about what is the actual business value to be achieved. And that could be, I want to have all my processes digitalized so I can, instead of having a product produced with hundreds of manual steps, I can have that fully automated and delivered to the customer. And then CPQ might be one piece of that story, but that is a great starting point. So we get like the overall scope, and we understand, okay, how can a CPQ fit into that, and what do we ultimately achieve when we discuss the different requirements in a CPQ solution. Second to that, make it a real part of your digital transformation. Think really like, okay, how can, from an end-to-end perspective, CPQ deliver you value? That means you gain efficiency, you unlock potential with new products, new ways of selling, and actually new business models. For example, subscriptions. You might be used to sell services, you might be used to sell products. You might have a need now to move more into subscription economy. CPQ will help you there, and that is something you should really address here, where your digitalization will help you, where CPQ will help you, and that connects very well into the vision. Another very important piece is CPQ is a key tool moving forward in your environment, and that means it needs to be on the agenda of your business unit lead or the CEO actually of your company. this is not just yet another system. It changes that much in the way you work. It changes that much in the way how you position your products with your customers, how you interact with your customers, and how the journey, the sales journey and the product experience journey in the very end will be for your customers, that needs to get very high attention. And as well, make sure that you, from time to time, get back to your vision and think through, okay, are we really on track? Do we really deliver into that vision, or are we just into details that maybe doesn't really matter in terms of what we want to achieve here? When you have your vision put together, I think you have done a great step and mostly the most important step when preparing for your implementation journey. But second to that, then you need to start, of course, from visions that are usually a little bit, high level, maybe a little bit untangible, partly maybe hard to understand because you may interpret it in this way or in that way. So make it tangible for the people, make it tangible for your organization, but as well for the CPQ vendor you're working with. So drill down your vision into success criteria or into a success metric. Usually you have several that either interact with each other or build on each other. And think about, again, then, okay, what do we really want to achieve in terms of delivering into the vision? What is most important here? Is it about efficiency? Is it about time to market for our new products, for example, time to delivery, when we have closed the deal or when we start a sales journey into delivering an actual product to a customer? Is cost reduction a topic for you? Is it about the premium customer journey, and so on and so forth? So really drill it down into topics, cluster it a little bit, make sure that people can relate to it, understand it, and that you have a common view on how to read this vision actually. And very much important in this work is as well, not only being visionary when you break it down, but really think as well about, okay, where are limitations today in your current business, in the way how you operate? Can your CPQ help you stepping over that and make that happen moving forward? Are there any additional mid and long-term needs that you need to consider? So just to give you a few ideas here, and when we talk about do's and don'ts, let's start with the do's. Make it easy, right? So when you talk success metric, there are of course hundreds of KPI systems, OKRs, and so on that you can use. Again, there is no best system how to structure that, how to cluster it. Pick something that your organization is used to. So you need not to explain the model. You need not to explain how do you get there, how to read it. So it's just something that the organization can work with that will make your life much, much easier. When it comes to the don'ts, please avoid putting technical solutions here or technical problem descriptions. That will not help you because it just will limit your implementation team and your people working with the CPQ in terms of how they operate. Give them the freedom to get to the solutions themselves and think about how they can deliver with their solutions into what is driving your success. Oops, sorry, that was one too fast. Next step is, now you have your vision, now you have talked about how to operationalize that a little bit. And the next step then would be to talk about ways of working. So it's really about define your target processes. Try to think about, okay, how do we work today? What works, what does not work? When we connect it into the vision, what we need to add, what we need to change, how can we make our lives easier? Where do we have maybe a lot of manual processes that we need to go through today? How can we transition that into more automated processes, into system supported processes, so we reduce errors, we reduce manual efforts? And you can use, again, very different ways of doing that, how you map your processes. I've put you here one very easy example that we have done ourselves in Tacton when, like 3-4 years ago, we have started our own CPQ journey, so to say, when we started to implement CPQ for Tacton. And there we started really to think full end to end. Okay, what are the processes and touch points we have in the entire sales journey until we deliver something to the customer, or we have delivered to the customer and customer is live. And then we have analyzed those processes and thought through like, okay, how do we envision that to be moving forward? At this point, of course, you cannot take 100% decision, right? You can give it a direction and you can kind of put your priorities. You may then in the very end realize that, okay, you have learned throughout the implementation that a few things should be different or may work more smoothly if you put it in a different way, or the different CPQ vendors might have different approaches to tackle some areas. That's perfectly fine. But it's really about making sure that you're not just copy paste what you have done the last 20 years, if I may say that. Think really about, okay, how do you want to operate in the future, and what may the future require from you how to operate, and what do your customers need actually in terms of interacting with you and the way of working to make them feel happy and make them feel appreciated in your sales journeys. The next step then is when you have your processes ready, think about how do you translate that into a system landscape. Most likely it's like CPQ will not be the only system that you have in place. It's as well most likely that you need to feed data from other systems into the CPQ, consolidate it and work it there. So that means from your target processes, you need to think a little bit about your system landscape. And when you think your system landscape, think a few things, of course, that are a bit more technical, like where to put master data, what is your strategy behind that, define a little bit the handover points. But in the very end, what is most important is to think about what will the user journey be in this system landscape. Is it kind of a joy of use? Is it easy to use? Is it performant enough? Will it connect your processes, your different teams, your organizations in a good and a smooth way that kind of delivers into your general way of working in your company, into the way how you should operate there, right? Because you can do a lot of fancy stuff that is really nice usually, but if no one wants to use it, you have wasted all your energy, your time and money. So really make sure that you keep the user on your first priority here. Make sure that it's a good experience working with your systems, and then the adoption will come in. That's almost given. And adoption is all what it is about when we talk about new systems, right? You want to really have your users using the systems and working with that and really getting everything out of that you have actually invested in even more. After that, again, we have the vision, we have the success metric, we have the processes, we have the system landscape. And now it's about like, okay, are you ready to take on a CPQ, right? You talk about configure, price, and quoting. So that means you need to know about your product structure. You need to know about your price structures and pricing, way of pricing. You need to know about how to quote, what to quote. So there's a lot of things you need to know, right? And usually when you start CPQ, or what we see quite often is that customers have had in the past a couple of different systems combined somewhat into something like a CPQ, but it was usually not in one place, or it was a combination of products that were in the system and others that were worked through manually because it's a bit more engineered to order, for example, or it was not properly documented, so there was a lot of engineering to be done around it. So when thinking CPQ and unlocking the full value of a CPQ, always think as well about, okay, are you ready with your data? And starting point is always to map out your organization and governance. So think about what is kind of the workflow in your organization? How do you actually sell? Think about, okay, do you need different levels of approvals? Like, okay, do I have like a very complex governance setup in my company that I need to consider? Work through that, map it out. With that, already clean it up a little bit if you can, and make sure that it's properly documented and not just somewhere in different heads or in different areas where it might be documented, but get it consolidated. Same with your product structure. Go through that and see, do you have any kind of white spots, sort of where you have either no documentation or very weak documentation on your products. quite often what we see is that there is a lot of knowledge in the heads of people. So try to get it out, get it structured, put it in Excel sheets or whatever way is working for you, but structure it out and get it a common structure across the different products, which is very important because you usually have not only one product, right? So you have maybe multiple. And when you do a CPQ implementation, it is a lot more efficient, time savvy, and more convenient actually if you follow one, or if you have one documentation structure and you need not to work all the time into different structure and try to reshape that and restructure it, reorganize it to make it later on happen in the CPQ. As well, when same with like an organization, when you look into your product structure, you might realize within the CPQ project, okay, there are a couple of products you never sell, or there are all products that you maybe just maintain for 1 or 2 customers. So really think through, do you really need that? Do you want to cut away a few, let's say ends that are just legacy and might not be worth spending time and effort bringing that into a system? It's always a very good chance to reflect and to review what you're actually doing. And as well, keep an eye on complexity, right? Nowadays, product structures got to a complexity quite often that is almost non-manageable, or just manageable with very huge efforts. So try to think as well, when thinking CPQ, can I reduce my complexity a little bit to make it easier to handle? And last part is then mostly the pricing. So usually when you have multinational setups, for example, you should look into, okay, do I have different pricing structures in the different regions? Familiarize with that, clarify that a bit. Quite often there's a lot of discussion to understand that and make sure that you get this together. And having all of that done, you have usually done quite a job preparing for your implementation, because then you will as well be able to explain it a little bit to a CPQ vendor, make sure that your own team working on that does really understand how everything works, where to get the data from, and how to read the data. Next step is now looking a little bit more into how to operationalize the whole thing, how to work later on in the project. And on that slide, you realize I have not put a lot of details in terms of what is the best methodology to do. And why is that the case? Because there are, I don't know how many project management methodologies out there. And I have my own opinion how I like to work, right? But is that, again, the best for every company? Most likely not. So here it begins. When you think about project methodology, don't think about what is most fancy on the market. Think about what will actually work with your company. Maybe not only limit yourself to that, maybe be as well a little bit innovative in that. If you come more from traditional ways of working, you might want to look more into agile ways of working, but don't go too big of a steps here. And the reason for it is that with the CPQ project, you already have so much work to do that you shouldn't spend all your energy into kind of convincing and working then through how you actually want to operate in the project, right? You should be able to focus on what is really relevant. When as well, one recommendation I will put here still, even if I not put on a or bet on a specific methodology, but usually you want to group your work a little bit. You want to map it out a little bit, phase it out a little bit. And doing so, do yourself a favor and try to bring in some themes into your work, right? So that you think more like, okay, not I will put this requirement and this and that in a row, but think more like, are there themes, topics you can cluster and address in a logical sequence? Whatever that could be. That can help you to keep a little bit control over the process of your work. It can help you consolidating a little bit the resources involved into the different streams, so they might not be stretched out over half a year, or whatever is the intensity of your project in the very end, but they may be able to focus over a time span of 2-3 weeks, and then their job is done, right? So that look into this this theme thing, if you can use that to help you being a little bit more resource efficient in the very end. When it comes to the don'ts, do yourself a favor and don't start detailing out each and everything before you actually get started. One reason is that every CPQ vendor operates a little bit different. Every CPQ platform is a little bit different. So the CPQ vendors most likely have different answers to your business problems, and they might tackle it a slightly different way. So give that a little bit room. The other thing is that what we usually see is that companies, of course, are super competent in their business they are doing, but usually they haven't done so many CPQ implementations. So it helps, again, not getting stuck with all the detail and trying to process and think everything through before you actually get started. Try more to nail down what is most important. Try to nail down what are kind of the general topics and issues you want to work through and you want to address, and then give the project team later on the room to detail that out and to specify that in a good way. Another don't, and I mentioned a little bit the agile way of working, which is kind of a positive and negative ghost in the corridors. There is a lot of good things with going agile, but as well the truth is that agile is not an answer to each and everything when we talk project methodology. So make sure that you use methodology in the right way and you put it in the right place. And my recommendation here would be then, if you are more on the agile path, which is definitely recommended in general when you do software projects, then look as well into do you need to and can you be agile in every area? And when it comes to CPQ, usually the configuration modeling and the price topics are not so much agile because the target isn't moving, right? You have a very clear target. You can use the agile methodologies a little bit to help you structure your work. That's perfectly fine, and you should always look into if that can help you. But don't think too agile about these things because they're not. And as well, think about what are other stakeholders in your companies or how they think about the project. Usually there are quite some asks and demands on your project. It could be on the budget side, it could be on the timeline side, and so on. So make sure that you consider that a little bit to, in the very end, land a proper project here and a good success. And last don't I want to give you here is maybe don't go for the big bang. That can work, but it's most likely a setup for failure. I haven't seen that too often that going with a big bang really works. So my recommendation is very clearly try starting a little bit smaller, maybe pilot it a little bit with one or two of your product lines, countries, or maybe operational units. But don't try to do everything in one step and then just go out and hope for the best, because you will as well learn step by step what you have not considered, maybe where you need to drive changes and so on. Then what about budget, right? When talking about CPQ, there is of course a cost coming with that. As we started, there should be quite a good value for you. So you should be able then to start from your value and see, okay, what is this actually your organization can gain from working with the CPQ, and start there to think about, okay, how much can you then and should you maybe spend into a CPQ to achieve that value, but as well to allow your organization to achieve that value. So don't be too restrictive with your budgets. I'm not saying you should spend a fortune. I'm just saying try to be realistic in terms of what is the real value of the CPQ for your company, and then try to set realistic budgets around that. What is important here as well is when we then talk budgets, is that you talk about those budgets. Make sure that at least the closest stakeholder group involved into your CPQ knows the budgets. They understand why the budgets are as they are and how they are connected to your success metrics. It's super important that people can understand it and can relate to that to ease up discussions later on in terms of how to prioritize, where to look at, what not to do, etc. If you're not clear about that, you will have those discussions all the time, over and over again. And I'm pretty sure you want to avoid that. So make sure that you talk about it as much as you can, and you should. Connect it to your values, make sure that people can relate to it, and that will help you quite a lot. Talking about the don'ts, again, don't just put numbers. Make sure that you reason your numbers with the value attached. And with the value attached, don't be too narrow. Try, again, bring it into more the themes that you want to address, not one of maybe 100 or 200 specific requirements. And don't lose the big picture or side of the big picture here. So it is quite often when it comes to budget that people try to be super in control over it, which is of course a good thing and a needed thing. But if you are too narrow, it could very much happen that you say, okay, I don't do something because it feels too expensive as I can't see the direct value attached to it. Try then to, in such a case, first connect it back into the big picture and think about, okay, if I spend the money into this specific requirement, for example, does it help me to achieve a greater goal that I'm after? If that is not the case, you can drop it, right? But if you come to a yes, maybe a clear yes, then go for it. If you come to a maybe, let's talk to your CPQ vendor, make sure that you have an informed discussion, and then take an informed decision about it. Next step, the team. No project without the team, right? So make sure that you set up your team for success. And start these discussions in your process to get to a CPQ as early as possible. Involve your CPQ vendor of choice, or maybe the CPQ vendors that are in your RFP process, to get their opinions, to have discussions there, to understand, okay, what is really needed and relevant and mandatory when working with those CPQ vendors. Make sure as well that your key stakeholders have focus on that project. Don't put it just like yet another project to them. Give it a clear focus and business priority. Define as well a core team. It's mostly when projects are not going well, that there is no core team, that there are like 20, 30 people involved, and it's to start with almost impossible to find the right person to talk to. Please avoid that. Make sure that you have a core team with clear responsibilities, clear assignment, and as well a clear allocation to the CPQ process project. Look as well a little bit into your midterm needs. So the CPQ project needs not only to be implemented, but CPQ is something that lives, right? You need to maintain it. You need to bring in new products. You need to update your price structures, maybe your organizations. So make sure that at an early stage, you already involve people who are later on maintaining the system. That could be from your support organization. That could be maybe from a third party you're usually using to maintain your systems. Could be somewhere in the business. That depends again on your company, but make sure that you have this part of your project team from a very early stage. As well, be honest with you in terms of what is your organization really capable to deliver. I've seen it quite often that targets for a CPQ program are super stretched. That is, of course, good because it should be ambitious. But if it's too ambitious, you will just lose that race. You will just get out frustrated. You will end up in disputes with your team, with your CPQ vendor. You might lose sight of what is the actual value we're working towards. So be really honest with you. Look into, okay, can we deliver such a CPQ at this time? Do we have the capacity to work with a CPQ vendor or implement stuff on our own? And if you have concerns about that, have a clear discussion with your CPQ vendor to get ideas, to get alternatives, or even to say, okay, it's great to do a CPQ, but let's do it in half a year because right now we can't afford it. And as well, last part, make sure that your core team is well trained. It is easy to say, it's sometimes hard to keep up with it, but plan some time, some budget for training. Do that in the very beginning of the project to make sure that people talk about the same thing, that people are familiar with the terms that are used within the CPQ system. Make sure that people know how to operate the system, not in terms as a user, but as a implementer sort of, or part of an implementation team. So how to administrate, how to build up stuff in your CPQ. As well, look at the project model you're following, right? When you have people who are maybe new to working in a project because they might have had jobs before that that were not really working in projects, you might want them to be trained in your project methodology, just making sure that they know how to do their part in the project and how to operate in the larger project team. That sounds somewhat maybe not reasonable, but that is really a clear recommendation. Do not only look into these kind of hard skills, look as well into soft skills and make sure that your team is prepared for that. And bit kind of closing here the larger picture. Try to visualize and map out your whole CPQ program, not only for, let's say, a first stage, but for the entire program, to fulfill the entire vision, and use that as an instrument to talk about the project, to market the project, to follow up a little bit on success with your stakeholders, with the executive sponsors. It is a great instrument usually to explain in very easy ways what to achieve, how to achieve, when to achieve it, and as well use it constantly as a success follow-up. When you do those projects, they can take time. It can be sometimes maybe frustrating because you feel like, okay, now I'm working for 3, 4, 5 months and we're still not done. Get back to your roadmap, think about, okay, what have you initially drafted and where is your target, and get motivated by that. And then last thing, and then I promise I'm done, is consider change management. In talking about CPQ, implementing CPQ is in any way usually a large change. It changes the way of working, it brings new systems in, it changes the way you communicate quite often because you put some maybe beforehand manual processes into the system. For example, when it comes to approvals, people need to get used to that. People need to get prepared for it. People need to get trained for it. People need to have their saying what they are after. For example, when you talk sales, they're usually the end user of the CPQ. So you cannot ignore them in the process, right? So make them part of that, make the end users sometimes feel part of that change. And that is really quite often a key next to having a good system, implementing it sort of in a good way in the organization and getting your organization into the boat that you row in the right direction with your CPQ. And sometimes it can be then that you need to give up on a few things because you realize the way change works in your company does not allow to go such a large step. So you may need to go 50%, but therefore you go that 50% successful. So don't drive a change in a way that is kind of ignoring the business culture in your company, or that is ignoring the way how your organization reacts to change. Keep a close eye on that and make it a priority specifically for the executive sponsor to drive that change and to be the sponsor of that change as well in your organization. All right, so we're at the end of the contact. So just quickly reminding, wrapping up here, when you start, put the vision first, make it tangible. Talk about your processes, talk through your processes, define your processes from a target perspective. Look into your system landscape, how the CPQ fits in there, what kind of optimizations can you do, put it from a user journey perspective, user experience perspective. Look into your data, structure it, make sure you get prepared for that. Talk about your project model, define it, set your team for success, and put all of that into a larger roadmap that you can follow up, that you can visualize, that you can use to talk about, and then go into change management and do that continuously. And one last part before we then go into the Q&A, don't get lost in all of those steps, right? Look after a CPQ vendor who helps you getting through those preparation steps. get your professional advice on that. You can maybe have that with the CPQ vendor directly, as I said, or you may even go to a more neutral sort of party like larger consulting companies who are used to this kind of processes and support those processes and get your help there. But be sure that preparing properly for a CPQ is 80% usually of the success. Of course, there is a lot of work to be done later on, but if you're badly prepared, you're almost in a position that you will fail. So now it's time for me to close my talking and to answer on your questions. And I think, Ralph, you may want to moderate that part.
Thank you very much, Johannes. Thanks for sharing some really good insights, I would say. So just a comment before we go into the questions. We got a couple of questions. I guess you might have some questions that will pop up later. So don't hesitate and just reach out, send us an email or get in touch with your contact person at Tacton. We try to deliver or give you answers right away. So one question that came in quite early when you talked about don't think and don't behave like a copycat and continue doing whatever you did before. Is there some kind of a golden rule when we look, as a company, we have a hell of a bunch of product variants and different products. So is there some rough number you can share with us regarding the percentage of your total portfolio that should be covered actually by a CPQ system?
Well, that's a tough question. I would say it depends a little bit how your portfolio is structured. You may be in the situation that you have like 2-3 product groups that represent, let's say, 80% of your revenues. Then, of course, focus on them first. And if you then have a next steps time, bring the rest in. But in general, I would say there is no real golden rule. What you, of course, should consider is, do you have more kind of a system configuration type of approach so that you need multiple products in the system in order to get to a solution for your customer? If that is the case, then, of course, you need to think through what type of products do you need in order to get to a complete solution. There's usually not that much of a value in configuring half of a solution and doing the rest somewhere outside the CPQ, right? So unfortunately, there is no golden rule. It's more that you need to think through, okay, what is it your customers are buying and how do you configure that and what is then needed in order to configure that? And the only advice I can give here is think really about, do you have any kind of cash cows, for example, in your portfolio that you can easily put up and where you can already kind of create a lot of value and insights into how to work with the CPQ and what the CPQ can deliver to you.
Okay. Thanks. Oh, sorry for that. I guess the second question, I noted down. I guess it's a hard one as well. It touches time frames, so maybe a realistic one. So I mean, I guess you highlighted that implementing a CPQ system isn't an easy task at all. But is there any, from your experience, a realistic time frame? So in which then should people think when they decide to go for a CPQ?
Yeah. So the timeline of the CPQ depends very much on the number and complexity of your products, because you somewhat need to get the product configuration data into the system, and that takes time. If you have that perfectly prepared, of course, it goes a little bit faster. If it's not that well prepared, it takes a little bit longer. The other part is how complex is your organization. Let's say you operate in 150 countries all over the world. You have in every country slightly different structures, how you operate, how you sell, how you price. If you have such a setup, then you might need like 2 to 3 years actually to go through your full CPQ program. That does not necessarily mean that your first project steps before you can go your first live may take you more than 6 months. But be aware that it's not done in such a setup in a few months. When you're a smaller company, let's say you have 1 or 2 key products that you sell in a few countries and where you have streamlined processes all around the globe, then a 6-month could be a very realistic assumption for you to get your CPQ live. When I talk about getting CPQ live, I always as well consider you need to have a bit of a preparation time for the project. As I mentioned, you need to get your people trained. You need to get sort of up and running with the project team. You need to test your system at a certain point. You might have a hypercare before you can really say, okay, now I'm done with the first step. But a 6-month is, I would say, a good average assumption for more smaller to mid-sized companies that have 1 or 2 key products, a bit more simpler organizational structures, and up to 3 years for the larger enterprises. Of course, again, there is no kind of, it is exactly like that, but that is something you can somewhat expect as realistic. And I think that is what you will hear from pretty much every CPQ vendor.
Okay. Thanks for that. Just checking the time. I think we have one at a time for one more question, hopefully a quicker and shorter one to answer. You shared some kind of a setup, a dream setup for a success team. From your experience, who should be leading a CPQ implementation project? Is this something that is on the list, top priority for the commercial department, engineering department, or of course for the IT department?
Yeah. So the short answer on that is
we have 3 minutes.
It follows your key priorities for the project and as well how you operate as a company. So usually sales has a very big part in the CPQ. So you want to definitely have your sales department involved to a large extent. Usually sales is not really equipped to run projects, so I wouldn't really recommend to let sales do that. I rather recommend to then, for example, let your IT organization host the project, but making sure that you have the right stakeholders involved. So if I nail it down, I would say it's in 90% of the cases, the IT department or business IT who is or should mostly drive the CPQ projects, but as a kind of a business request from your business teams like sales, growth, and maybe even manufacturing.